The heavy glass doors of Le Jardin restaurant swung open with such force that the crystal chandelier above trembled, casting dancing shadows across the marble floor as Marcus Wellington strode inside like a man who owned not just the world, but everyone in it. His expensive Italian suit couldn't hide the anger radiating from his tall frame, and his cold blue eyes swept the elegant dining room with the kind of disdain that made seasoned waiters suddenly find urgent tasks in the kitchen. The hostess, a young woman named Sarah, who had been working at Le Jardin for 3 years without a single complaint, felt her hands shake as she approached him with her practiced smile. But before she could even speak, Marcus snapped his fingers at her like she was nothing more than a trained animal. "Table 12, now, and make sure it's spotless, because I can see dust on everything in this pathetic excuse for fine dining," he barked, his voice carrying across the restaurant and causing other diners to look up from their meals in uncomfortable silence. Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she led him to the corner table, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. And when Marcus pulled out his phone and began shouting at someone about stock prices and incompetent employees, she quickly retreated to safety behind the reception desk. Within minutes, Thomas, the restaurant's most experienced waiter, who had served celebrities and politicians with grace for over 15 years, approached Marcus's table with the confidence that comes from handling difficult customers. But that confidence crumbled the moment Marcus looked up from his phone and fixed him with a stare that could freeze fire. "About time someone with half a brain showed up," Marcus said, his voice dripping with contempt as he gestured dismissively at the perfectly arranged table setting. "Though I suppose that's asking too much in a place that clearly hires people off the street." Thomas, a kind man with 2 children and a mortgage, felt his professional composure slip as Marcus continued his assault on everything from the temperature of the dining room to the quality of the tablecloth. But when Marcus began making personal comments about Thomas's appearance and suggesting he wasn't smart enough to work anywhere decent, the veteran waiter's eyes filled with tears of humiliation and rage. The other staff members watched in horror as Thomas, a man they all respected and loved, hurried away from the table with his head down, disappearing into the kitchen where he stood against the wall, trying to compose himself while his hands shook with suppressed emotion. Manager Robert Chen, who had built Le Jardin's reputation on exceptional service in treating both guests and staff with respect, felt his jaw clench as he witnessed the scene, knowing that he needed to handle this situation delicately because Marcus Wellington's family name appeared on the city's most influential donor lists and business partnerships. When Robert approached the table with his diplomatic smile and gentle manner, Marcus didn't even let him introduce himself before launching into a vicious critique of the restaurant's standards, the staff's competence, and Robert's own ability to run a proper establishment, his words cutting through the elegant atmosphere like broken glass. "This place is a disgrace, and if you can't train your people to show proper respect to someone of my standing, then maybe you shouldn't be in business at all," Marcus declared, his voice rising with each word as other diners began to whisper among themselves, and some even requested to be moved to different tables. Robert felt his carefully maintained professional mask beginning to slip as Marcus continued his verbal assault, but years of experience had taught him that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the person across from him seemed to thrive on creating chaos and misery wherever he went. The second waiter, Maria, who had been working at Le Jardin for 2 years and had never received anything but praise from customers and management alike, reluctantly approached the table when Robert gestured for her to try serving Marcus, but her hands trembled as she poured his water because she had heard every cruel word he had spoken to Thomas. When Marcus noticed the slight shake in her hands, his eyes lit up with the kind of predatory satisfaction that came from sensing weakness, and he began a systematic destruction of her confidence that left her fighting back tears as she tried to maintain her composure. While he criticized everything from her posture, to her accent, to her ability to perform the simplest tasks. "Are you people completely incompetent?" Or is this some kind of joke? Marcus demanded, his voice echoing through the restaurant as Maria fled to the kitchen, joining Thomas in the staff area where they consoled each other while the other employees gathered around them with expressions of sympathy and rage. One by one, the experienced waiters found reasons to avoid Marcus's table, claiming they needed to help other customers or handle kitchen duties, leaving only the newest hire, a nervous young man named David, who had started just 2 weeks earlier, to face the growing storm of Marcus's fury. David approached the table with the kind of terror that comes from knowing you're walking into a trap, but having no choice but to spring it anyway. And when Marcus saw his obvious fear, his cruel smile widened as he prepared to deliver another devastating performance that would reduce this new victim to tears, like all the others. The entire restaurant held its breath as David stood frozen beside the table, Marcus's cold eyes boring into him with anticipation, the air thick with tension and the promise of another humiliating spectacle. But just as Marcus opened his mouth to begin his latest attack, the kitchen door swung open with quiet authority, and Zara Johnson stepped into the dining room, her presence immediately commanding attention as she moved across the floor with the kind of calm confidence that suggested she had faced much worse storms than the one brewing at table 12. Zara Johnson moved across the restaurant floor with the kind of quiet strength that seemed to absorb the chaos around Marcus's table, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene as she noticed David's trembling hands, the tears threatening to spill from his young face, and the way other diners had stopped eating to watch what everyone expected would be another brutal display of Marcus's cruelty. She wore the same black uniform as the other waiters, but something about her presence made it look like armor rather than service attire, and when she reached table 12, she didn't hover nervously at the edge like the others had done. Instead, positioning herself directly across from Marcus with her shoulders square and her chin raised, Marcus looked up from his phone with the predatory smile already forming on his lips, clearly expecting this new victim to cower before him like all the rest. But when his cold blue eyes met Zara's steady brown gaze, something unexpected happened. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't show even the slightest sign of intimidation. Finally, someone with enough sense to approach my table properly, Marcus began, his voice carrying the familiar edge of condescension that had reduced grown men and women to tears. Though I suppose that's too much to hope for in a place that clearly scrapes the bottom of the barrel for staff. Zara listened to his opening attack without changing expression, her hands folded calmly in front of her as she absorbed every cruel word. And when he paused to gauge her reaction, she did something that no one in the restaurant had ever seen before. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. The simple action sent a shockwave through the dining room as conversation stopped mid-sentence and forks paused halfway to mouths, while Marcus stared at her in complete bewilderment, his brain struggling to process what had just happened, because in his 43 years of treating service workers like dirt beneath his expensive shoes, not one had ever dared to sit at his table uninvited. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising with a mixture of outrage and confusion as he gestured wildly at her seated form. "Get up right now and show some respect, or I'll have you fired before you can blink." Zara remained perfectly still, her eyes never leaving his face as she studied him with the kind of calm attention that a scientist might give to an interesting but dangerous specimen. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that Marcus had to lean forward to hear her words. "I see you're having a difficult evening," she said simply, those 6 words carrying more power than all of Marcus's shouting and threats combined, because they contained something he hadn't heard in years: genuine observation without judgment, concern without fear. Marcus felt his prepared tirade die in his throat as he stared at this woman who seemed completely unaffected by his rage, her steady presence creating a strange bubble of calm around their table, while the rest of the restaurant watched in fascination and terror. "You have no idea what kind of evening I'm having," Marcus snapped, trying to regain his momentum. But his voice lacked its usual venom, because Zara's unblinking attention was making him feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with his wealth or status. She nodded slowly, as if his anger confirmed something she had already suspected, and her next words hit him like a physical blow. "You're right. I don't know what's troubling you, but I can see that you're in pain." The word pain seemed to hang in the air between them like a live wire, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, because no one had used that word to describe him in decades. People called him difficult, demanding, impossible, cruel, but never someone in pain. "I'm not in pain, I'm angry," he protested, but his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Angry at incompetent people who can't do their jobs properly. Angry at establishments that think they can treat people, like me, with disrespect. Zara listened to his explanation without interrupting, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she were hearing something beyond his actual words. And when he finished, she asked a question that made his blood run cold. "When was the last time someone sat with you during a meal?" The question was so unexpected, so personal, so completely unrelated to anything that had happened in the restaurant, that Marcus felt his carefully constructed armor begin to crack, because the honest answer was that he couldn't remember the last time anyone had willingly shared a meal with him, or even the last time he had eaten without conducting business or checking his phone. "That's none of your business," he said. But his voice came out as a whisper rather than the roar he had intended. And Zara's gentle nod suggested that his non-answer had told her everything she needed to know. Manager Robert Chen stood frozen, near the kitchen doors, torn between intervening to protect his newest employee and watching in amazement as this woman accomplished what years of customer service training had never taught any of them. She had made Marcus Wellington stop shouting. The other diners had given up any pretense of eating and were openly staring at the unprecedented scene, while the kitchen staff peered through the service window like they were watching a magic show. Because somehow this quiet woman had transformed the restaurant's most feared customer into someone who looked almost ... human. Zara leaned back in her chair, never breaking eye contact with Marcus, and asked another question that cut straight through all his bluster and bravado. "What are you really angry about?" The words hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach, because they forced him to look beyond the convenient targets of his rage, the waiters, the managers, the world in general, and examine the deeper sources of his fury, the loneliness that ate at him every night, the business failures that kept him awake, the growing certainty that his money was the only thing that made people tolerate his presence. Marcus Wellington found himself returning to Le Jardin every Tuesday evening for the next 3 weeks. Though he couldn't explain to himself why, he kept coming back to a place where he had been so thoroughly unsettled by a woman who refused to follow the script that everyone else in his life had learned by heart. Each time he entered the restaurant, his eyes would automatically search for Zara among the staff, and each time she would appear at his table with that same calm presence that made him feel like she could see straight through the expensive suits and cruel words to something he had forgotten existed inside himself. On his second visit, Marcus tried to regain control by launching into his usual tirade about the temperature of his soup, the placement of his silverware, and the speed of service, but Zara simply listened to his complaints and then asked him if he had eaten anything that day besides his lunch meeting, a question that caught him so off guard that he admitted he had survived on nothing but coffee and antacids since 6 that morning. She returned with a small plate of warm bread and honey, setting it down without ceremony and saying quietly, "Your body needs more than anger to keep going," words that somehow made his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The third Tuesday brought a business disaster that left Marcus's construction company facing a lawsuit and his reputation in tatters. And when he stormed into the restaurant with his phone pressed to his ear, screaming at his lawyer about incompetent contractors and backstabbing partners, Zara waited until he finished his call before approaching his table. She didn't sit down this time, but she stood close enough that he could see the genuine concern in her dark eyes as she observed the way his hand shook while he tried to light a cigarette, the tremor in his voice when he ordered his usual scotch, the exhaustion that made his shoulders sag, despite his efforts to maintain his commanding presence. "Hard day?" she asked simply, and something about the way she said it made Marcus realize that she wasn't asking out of politeness or professional duty, but because she actually cared about the answer, a realization that terrified him more than any business failure ever could. He found himself telling her about the lawsuit, the workers who had been injured because of faulty equipment, the families who were suing him for damages he couldn't afford to pay, words tumbling out of his mouth like water through a broken dam because he hadn't spoken honestly to another human being in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. Zara listened without judgment, without offering empty reassurances or business advice, and when he finished, she simply nodded and said, "It sounds like you're carrying a lot of responsibility," words that acknowledged his burden without excusing his behavior toward others. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to notice things about Zara that made him curious, despite himself. The way she always remembered exactly how he liked his coffee, the gentle manner she used with elderly customers, the fact that she never seemed to eat during her shifts, but would slip leftover food into containers that she took home at the end of the night. He noticed that she worked longer hours than anyone else, covering for coworkers who called in sick and staying late to help with cleanup, and that she had a habit of leaving small tips for the busboys from her own pocket when she thought no one was looking. One evening, when a drunk customer at another table began making crude comments to a young waitress, Marcus watched Zara intervene with such quiet authority that the man apologized and left without causing further trouble, and he realized that this woman possessed a kind of strength that had nothing to do with money or power or the ability to intimidate others. The fourth Tuesday brought news that his company's insurance had been canceled, leaving him personally liable for millions in damages, and when Marcus arrived at the restaurant, his usual anger had been replaced by a hollow desperation that made his voice sound like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Zara took one look at his face and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a cup of chamomile tea that she placed in front of him without explanation, and when he started to protest that he hadn't ordered tea, she interrupted him with words that hit like a physical blow. "Some burdens are too heavy to carry alone." The simple sentence shattered something inside Marcus's chest, a wall he had built so carefully over the years that he had forgotten it was there. And suddenly he was crying in the middle of Le Jardin, tears streaming down his face, while other diners stared and whispered, but he couldn't stop because the weight of his loneliness was finally too much to bear. Zara sat down across from him without hesitation, her presence a steady anchor while he fell apart, and she didn't try to comfort him with empty words or tell him that everything would be okay. Instead, reaching across the table to place her hand over his shaking fingers while he sobbed out years of buried pain. "I don't understand why you're being kind to me," Marcus whispered through his tears, his voice broken and raw as he looked up at this woman who had somehow seen past his cruelty. To the terrified, lonely man underneath, "I've been horrible to you, to everyone here, and you still, .. His voice trailed off because he couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't understand why anyone would show compassion to someone who had spent his life hurting others. But Zara's answer would change everything he thought he knew about human nature and the possibility of redemption. Zara looked into Marcus's tear-filled eyes with the kind of deep sadness that comes from understanding pain too well, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that had shaped her into the woman who could sit calmly in the face of another person's storm. "Because 5 years ago, I was sitting in a hospital room watching my 15-year-old brother die from a drug overdose, and the doctor who came to tell me he was gone was the most arrogant, cold man I had ever met," she said quietly, her words cutting through Marcus's sobs like a gentle blade. "He spoke to me like I was nothing, treated me like my grief didn't matter, because we were just another poor family from the wrong side of town. And I hated him so much that I wanted to scream until my throat bled. Marcus stopped crying, his breath catching in his chest as he stared at her, unable to understand why she was telling him this story when he had just broken down in front of her like a child. But Zara continued speaking with the steady voice of someone who had learned hard truths about human nature. But then I saw him in the hallway an hour later, sitting alone in a corner, with his head in his hands. And I realized that he had just lost 3 patients that night, including a child the same age as my brother, and that his coldness wasn't cruelty but a wall he had built to protect himself from drowning in everyone else's pain. She explained, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face as she watched him absorb her words. I understood that hurt people often hurt people, not because they're evil, but because they're drowning and don't know how to ask for help. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow because he recognized himself in her description of that doctor, saw his own desperate attempts to keep the world at arm's length through anger and cruelty, and he realized that this woman had seen through his defenses from the very first night because she had learned to recognize the signs of someone who was slowly drowning in their own pain. That doesn't excuse what I've done, Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from crying as he thought about all the people he had hurt, all the tears he had caused, all the nights he had gone home to his empty mansion and wondered why he felt so hollow inside, despite having everything money could buy. Zara shook her head slowly, her hand still covering his as she spoke words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. An explanation is the first step toward healing. Over the next month, Marcus's carefully constructed world began to crumble around him as the lawsuit destroyed his business. His so-called friends abandoned him when his money disappeared, and his employees scattered to other companies, leaving him alone in an office that had once been the center of his empire. He sold his mansion to pay legal fees, moved into a small apartment that felt like a prison cell compared to his former luxury, and discovered that without his wealth and power, he was just another lonely man with no one to call when the nights stretched endlessly before him. The only constant in his collapsing world was Tuesday evenings at Le Jardin, where Zara continued to serve him with the same quiet dignity, even though he could barely afford the cheapest items on the menu. And she never mentioned his obvious financial struggles, or the way his expensive suits had been replaced by clothes that hung loose on his increasingly thin frame. One particularly devastating Tuesday, when Marcus had spent his last $100 on a simple pasta dish and a glass of water, he noticed Zara bringing him bread and soup that he hadn't ordered, and when he started to protest that he couldn't pay for extra food, she simply said that the kitchen had made too much and it would go to waste otherwise. He knew she was lying, knew that she had paid for his meal from her own modest wages, and the realization that this woman he had once treated so terribly was now taking care of him, when no one else in the world cared whether he lived or died, finally broke the last of his resistance. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as he stared at the bowl of soup that represented more kindness than he had received from anyone in years. "Why are you helping me when I don't deserve it, when I treated you like dirt, when everyone else has given up on me?" Zara sat down across from him for what would be the last time in their strange relationship, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she prepared to tell him a truth that would change everything. "Because 3 weeks after my brother died, when I was sitting in this exact restaurant applying for this job with no experience and no hope, the manager told me I wasn't qualified and started to send me away," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of memory and gratitude. But an old man at table 7 overheard the conversation and stood up to tell the manager that anyone who could handle grief with such dignity deserved a chance, and he offered to pay my wages for the first month while I learned the job. Marcus felt his heart stop beating as the implications of her story sank in, remembering a night 5 years ago when he had been dining alone and had witnessed a young woman being rejected for a position. Remembering the impulse of compassion, that had moved him to intervene before his life became consumed by bitterness and rage. That old man saved my life, Zara continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, and I promised myself that, if I ever had the chance to pass on that kindness, I would take it, no matter how difficult the person or how impossible the situation seemed. And as she spoke these words, Marcus realized that he was looking at his own redemption in the form of a woman whose life he had unknowingly saved years ago, before he forgot how to be human. 6 months after Marcus Wellington's world collapsed, and the shocking revelation of his connection to Zara's past, he stood outside Le Jardin restaurant at dawn, his hands shaking, not from anger, but from nervous excitement as he clutched a manila folder containing the most important business proposal of his life. One that would either restore his purpose or confirm that he was beyond redemption. The early morning light painted the empty street in soft gold, and through the restaurant's windows, he could see Zara inside, setting up tables for the lunch service with the same careful attention to detail that had first caught his notice, all those months ago when he was a different man, living a different life. Marcus had spent the last 6 months working construction jobs, washing dishes in small diners, and learning what it meant to earn money through honest labor rather than inherited wealth. And every blister on his hands and ache in his back had taught him something new about the dignity of work and the value of treating every person with respect. The folder in his hands contained the results of those hard-earned lessons, a business plan for transforming Le Jardin into something revolutionary, a restaurant that would serve not just food but hope, employing people who had been written off by society and giving them the skills and confidence to rebuild their lives. When Zara looked up and saw him through the window, her smile was like sunrise after the longest night, and she unlocked the door to let him inside, where the familiar smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee wrapped around him like a warm embrace. "I have something to show you," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. And as he spread the documents across table 12, where their journey had begun, he watched Zara's eyes widen as she read about job training programs for ex-convicts, scholarships for single mothers, and a kitchen that would operate as both a fine dining establishment and a culinary school for people who had never imagined they could learn such skills. The business model was simple but revolutionary. Customers would pay premium prices for exceptional food, while knowing that their money was directly funding second chances for people who desperately needed them, and the staff would receive not just wages but comprehensive training, counseling support, and help with everything from housing to healthcare. "I've been meeting with investors, social workers, and community leaders," Marcus explained, his voice growing stronger with each word as he described months of research and planning. "And I've found funding sources that will cover the initial costs, but I need a partner who understands both the business and the people we want to help. Someone who has the trust of the community and the skills to make this work." Zara listened in stunned silence as Marcus outlined how the restaurant would operate with 2 kitchens, one serving the regular menu to paying customers, and another providing free meals to homeless individuals and struggling families, creating a model that would be financially sustainable while addressing real social needs. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, though her eyes already held the answer as she looked at the detailed plans that would transform her workplace into something that could change hundreds of lives. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either begin the most important chapter of his life or close the book on any hope of meaningful redemption. "Because I want you to be my partner," he said simply, "not my employee, but my equal partner in every sense, making decisions together, sharing profits equally, and building something that proves people can change, that second chances matter, and that kindness is not weakness, but the strongest force in the world." The proposal hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning the chasm between Marcus's dark past and the possibility of a brighter future. And Zara stared at him for so long that he began to fear she would reject his offer, tell him that some actions could never be forgiven and some people could never truly change. But then she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. The same gesture she had made months ago when he had broken down in tears, except now her touch carried not just comfort, but partnership, hope, and the promise of transformation. "When do we start?" she asked, and Marcus felt tears of joy and relief stream down his face as he realized that his redemption was not just possible, but already beginning. The next 8 months passed in a whirlwind of renovation, training, and community outreach, as Marcus and Zara worked 18-hour days to transform their vision into reality. And Marcus discovered that the satisfaction of building something meaningful with his own hands far exceeded any pleasure he had ever derived from inherited wealth or power over others. The grand reopening of Le Jardin brought together an unlikely crowd of investors and former homeless individuals, business leaders and ex-convicts, social workers and food critics, all united by curiosity about this experiment in compassionate capitalism. As Marcus stood behind the host station, greeting each guest with genuine warmth, instead of the cold calculation that had once defined his interactions with others, he watched Zara move through the dining room like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of second chances, introducing former gang members who had become skilled chefs to city councilmen, helping single mothers who had learned to manage the front desk serve meals to the same wealthy customers who had once looked through them as if they were invisible. Thomas, the veteran waiter whom Marcus had reduced to tears on that first terrible night, now worked as head of staff training, teaching new employees not just proper service techniques but the importance of treating every person who walked through their doors with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. The evening's most powerful moment came when Marcus took the microphone to address the gathered crowd, his voice strong and clear as he looked out at faces that represented every level of society, all brought together by the radical idea that everyone deserved not just a meal, but a chance to transform their lives. And he realized that he was no longer the angry, broken man who had terrorized restaurant staff, but someone who had learned that true wealth came not from what you could take from the world, but from what you could give back to it.